25 minutes away from another set of poll closings. Let's take a look at that great big electoral map at this hour. Look at the states that have been called, those that have not been called yet. And you can see we are at about 180 some electoral votes. I think it's 185 for George W. Bush, 182 for Al Gore, at least by my last count. And let's talk to Hal Bruno now, while we're thinking about maps, about some of those states that are still outstanding that we're not able to call yet. Hal.
Judy, let's talk about three Midwestern battlegrounds that are absolutely crucial. Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Missouri. First of all, Wisconsin. Madison, that's where Ralph Nader is doing a lot of harm to Al Gore. He's running with about 6 or 7% of the vote there, and that should be a Democratic stronghold. Gore is doing very well in Milwaukee, and George Bush is doing good in the rest of the state like he's supposed to. But what's hurting Gore is Ralph Nader in the Madison area. Going on to Missouri, if I can get the Madden machine to work right, okay? All right, we'll go to Minnesota. In Minnesota, Al Gore is doing very well in Minneapolis, and then he's doing surprisingly well in the Minneapolis suburbs. So it's sort of a repeat of what happened over in Philadelphia. However, up here in the Iron Range country, which should be, well, Bernie, take it away. Something's happening here.
Well, we'll come right back to you. CNN declares that Vice President Al Gore wins Minnesota. Wins Minnesota's 10 electoral votes. And you were just making the point about his voting strength in various parts of the state and surprisingly having done well outside in the suburbs.
Doing well in the Minneapolis suburbs, and Ralph Nader was not as much a factor there as he was down in Wisconsin. Now let's talk about Missouri. Missouri is a crucial state. Okay, we don't have time for Missouri, we'll do it later.
Well, we always have time for the Show Me State, but we just want to talk about some of the things behind that victory in Minnesota. But here now is the very latest count. Vice President Gore still slightly ahead of Governor Bush in the electoral vote total, 192 to 185. CNN just declaring Mr. Gore the winner in Minnesota.
And if you look at this map once again and cast your eyes out west to where everybody has expected for most of this campaign to happen in California, you begin to see that the states begin to close around the hopes of George W. Bush. There are simply fewer and fewer places where he can pick up enough votes to get to 270 unless an amazing upset happens out west.
But we should keep in mind, as Candy Crowley just told us from Austin, where she's talking to the Bush people, she said they have not entirely accepted the notion, as we and some other news organizations have called it, that Florida and Pennsylvania will end up in Al Gore's camp. She said they are still looking at absentee ballots. They are not ready to concede those two states yet.
And while it's clear he's running out of real estate, why do I have the feeling that there are going to be some races contested?
Well, I think it's possible in a really, really close race. What we haven't reported, of course, are the margins in these states. You have a very good point, Bernie. If some of these states come down to a couple of thousand votes each, that's exactly what we can expect to happen. But I think here, Bill, we've been talking about how issues like the environment and guns may have hurt Al Gore in some places, but surely in the suburbs around Minneapolis, those are the kinds of issues that play pretty well.
Well,
Yeah,
that was the point Hal Bruno was just
talking
making.
about all that is Hal Bruno. Hal, let's go back to you for the rest of your explanation about Minnesota.
Yeah, it all happened so fast. Al Gore did very well within the Twin Cities. But what was surprising, as we said, is in the Minneapolis and St. Paul suburbs, he did much better than expected, and he did well up here in the Iron Range country. George Bush did fine in the rest of the state, but it was up there in the Iron Range and in those Minneapolis suburbs and the Twin Cities itself where Al Gore won it, and Nader was not the factor in Minnesota that he's been in other places.
Okay.
Well, I think it's important. I think it's important at this time to recap that we still have, as we look back at that big electoral map a minute ago, about 8 or 9 states that we are not able to give to either Al Gore or George W. Bush right now.
That's right, and Bush's, I think, last hopes remain in the West, and he's got to pull a real hat trick to pull some of those western states. Now let's take a look at how it was that Al Gore carried Minnesota. Well, you know, a third of the voters of Minnesota voted for Jesse Ventura. He won on a bare plurality. Let's take a look at how the Jesse Ventura voters went in the state of Minnesota today. And according to our exit poll, they went for Al Gore. Oh, well, I can tell you they went for Al Gore by a bare majority. 51% for Gore, 38% for Bush, 9% for Nader, the third-party candidate. So it's pretty clear to me that, you know, with Minnesota, a divided state, the Ventura vote was crucial for Al Gore, even though he did not endorse Al Gore.
Which also tells us something about George W. Bush's attempts, or lack of it, to pick up the reformer mantle of one John McCain. You'll remember that after McCain beat him badly in New Hampshire, suddenly George Bush described himself as a reformer with results. He never really stressed that point, except in terms of Social Security and education reform, but on issues like campaign finance reform, he was pretty quiet, and that may be one explanation of why the Ventura vote did not
Ventura did not endorse Bush or Gore. He said he might vote for Jerry Hagelin or a third minor party candidate, but that vote seems to have gone very heavily for Al Gore and was the key to Minnesota.
Despite the presence of Nader.
Despite the presence of Nader, that's right. The
and
Ventura
Nader
vote,
polling.
a lot of it, 9% went for Ralph Nader, but clearly most of it went for Al Gore.
We should also point out that Minnesota does tend to be a very democratic state. It was in 1984, Walter Mondale, his home state, the only state that they carried.
Sure.
Dukakis carried that state. But it's interesting, Bill, you know, we've been hearing about the Dukakis notion that so many states were in play. It turns out at least Gore picked up one of them. Bernie?
Let's go to Washington. What do you suppose Mary Madeline and Mike McCurry are thinking now, being the partisans they are, as they analyze the data as we reported? Mary, to you first.
Well, I want to reiterate the competition in Florida and Pennsylvania isn't over, but as the Bush campaign looks west of the states that you've been looking at, there is a way to add 33 states up to the 270 plus. And as they went to bed, as you will, and as our exit polls seem to be suggesting, even though we're not talking about them, Bush is leading in all those states. Yes, it's threading the needle, as we say, but they see their way there and, again, are not giving up on Pennsylvania and Florida.
Michael.
You know, if you talk to the Gore campaign folks, they say the news tonight are the news. New Mexico, New Hampshire, two states that they really went out and tried to win as if it was a New Hampshire primary contest. They've thrown everything at those two states. I was not surprised to hear John King report a little bit earlier that even the president has been doing turnout calls out west. They've got a very massive mobilization effort underway right now that they think will bring it home for the vice president by the time that the evening is over. One other thought, we haven't talked about this tonight too. The closeness of this race is not generating any kind of mandate at the congressional level in either the Senate or the House for either one of the two presidential candidates. We have to start thinking a little bit about what kind of shape both candidates will be in to govern if they end up with a very divided electorate and a very divided Congress come next January.
Please address this question. First, you, Mary. Why do you suppose Rick Lazio lost tonight to Hillary Rodham Clinton?
Well, I think we addressed this earlier. There are 2 million more Democrats in the state of New York. He only campaigned for 5 hours. 5 months, and he didn't have the entire weight of the White House behind him. He wasn't able to bed people in the Lincoln bedroom for fundraisers. He wasn't able to use the president to drop photos out of the White House. He was at a serious disadvantage up against a formidable foe who had all of this at her back, all of these advantages of the incumbency of the White House.
Mary missed one very important fact. Hillary Clinton worked her heart out. She went all over that state, even upstate New York, where sometimes Democrats are not greeted warmly. She went and really did convince the people of New York that she wanted to be their senator, and that message sent her to the Senate tonight.
Bernie, let me make a point about this. Hillary Clinton went state shopping for a Senate seat. She has grown up in Illinois. She lived in Arkansas. She looked for a state where there was a significant Democratic registration advantage. She's no dummy, but she ran a very dull campaign, said absolutely nothing. Yes, it was methodical, but it had nothing to do with anything that she has ever done in her life or any state that she's ever lived in.
Neither of you has mentioned a person I alluded to earlier here. I happen to believe that her husband whispering strategy into her ears and campaigning with her was a major factor. Now, allow me to turn that point to the national presidential race and ask you, would this race be as close as it is between Al Gore and Governor Bush had President Clinton campaigned doggedly for and with Al Gore. Mary, you first.
Well, if Al Gore loses, then that's a distinct possibility if people continue to vote just because states are being called. The West still has to get out there and vote. Of course, that's what the Democrats will charge, but our own polls here at CNN said that 40% would be less likely to vote for the vice president if Bill Clinton was out there. I'll say again, he had to become his own man or campaign as his own man, as it were, but Bill Clinton was a drag on him with those very voters that he needed at the end, and I think he made one of the few right decisions of that otherwise badly run campaign.
I couldn't disagree more. The story tonight is turnout, momentum, mobilization. The president has been a very key part of the Democratic effort to turn out the base of the Democratic Party tonight, which loves this president. And I think if the vice president wins tonight, a very large part of the reason is because the Bill Clinton Democratic Party came home and came back to the center. We are all new Democrats now. That is the legacy that the president gave to the vice president, and that's probably why the vice president will win.
Excuse me, minority voters in urban centers and the union vote are not new Democrats. And God forbid that Al Gore does get elected. It'll be impossible for him to govern with this old liberal Democrat coalition. They are not even of this century. Those will be the groups that are responsible for why he's ahead in some of these states now and how he's going to appeal to them and still govern for the rest of the nation in some semblance of a new Democratic posture is impossible to fathom.
As referee, I'm going to step in here and say, go to your corners for a moment. And you're in Washington.
You think Mary's going to jump on the inaugural platform if Gore wins and try to drag him away?
Well, they're in Washington, and we're going to check in with our man, Wolf Blitzer, who will give us a little bit about an idea of how things look in the balance of power on the Hill right now. Wolf?
Bernie, we've been spending a lot of time talking about the Senate, sometime about the governors. We now have the first pickup in the House of Representatives. The Democrat, Brad Carson, defeating Andy Ewing. This is a seat that was given up because Representative Tom Coburn, the Republican, was retiring. A Democrat has now picked up that seat in Oklahoma. In Connecticut, look at this. Representative Sam Gadenson is trailing the Republican Robert Simmons. Gadenson, 20-year veteran in the U.S. Senate, the ranking Democrat on the House International Relations Committee. In Pennsylvania, a very close race between Melissa Hart and Terry Van Horn. The Democrat and the Republican were in a bitter battle, very close right now, still very tight. We can't call this race. Let's come back to that later, but for now, let's go back to Judy on the National Desk.